In 1963, two bodies were found on a riverbank, hidden under cardboard. Yet they died simultaneously, with no poison in their systems. This is the Bogle-Chandler mystery, and the truth is absolutely terrifying. The sweltering New Year's Eve of 1962 began with a sophisticated party in the suburbs of Sydney. It was the dawn of a new era, but for two secret lovers, the first sunrise of 1963 brought a bizarre and inexplicable demise that would haunt Australian investigators for the next 40 years. Dr. Gilbert Bogle was a brilliant physicist, a Rhodes Scholar whose mind was built for logic. Margaret Chandler was a vibrant mother of two, caught in the experimental culture of the early 60s. When they slipped away from a New Year's party into the humid darkness of January 1st, no one could have predicted the macabre scene they would leave behind. Hours later, their bodies were discovered on the muddy banks of the Lane Cove River. But this was no ordinary crime scene. Investigators were immediately struck by the eerie staging. Dr. Bogle was found half-dressed, yet his clothing was carefully arranged to make him look fully clothed. A short distance away, Margaret was found entirely concealed beneath flattened cardboard beer boxes and a heavy piece of carpet. It looked like the work of a meticulous killer hiding a shameful act. However, the autopsy revealed a medical impossibility. Both victims had died at the exact same moment, yet coroners found no signs of a struggle, no trauma, and absolutely no poison in their systems. Their hearts simply stopped beating in unison, leaving behind a riddle that defied every law of forensic science. How do two healthy adults simply cease to exist simultaneously without a single trace of foul play? For over 40 years, the Bogle-Chandler case stood as Australia's most perfect locked-room mystery, only without the room. It defied logic, baffled the country's top medical experts, and spawned wild theories ranging from Cold War espionage and LSD experiments to a calculated, jealous murder. We are going to walk through every bizarre, every strange alibi, and the chilling, invisible truth that finally emerged decades later. If you are fascinated by these types of unsolvable historical mysteries and the dark secrets hidden in the shadows of the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss an investigation. The truth behind the cardboard boxes is far stranger and far more terrifying than any detective could have ever imagined. It is a story of a silent killer that no one saw coming, and we are diving deep into the evidence right now. The Lane Cove River in 1963 was a winding ribbon of murky water slicing through the dense, eucalyptus-scented bushland of northern Sydney. By day, it was a picturesque escape for families and golfers, but by night, the secluded tracks leading down to the water transformed into a notorious lover's lane. The air that night was thick with the rhythmic, droning hum of cicadas and the heavy, oppressive humidity of a midsummer heat wave. Mangroves clawed at the muddy banks, creating a labyrinth of deep shadows where secrets could easily be kept. It was here, in the suffocating darkness around 4 in the morning, that Gilbert Bogle parked his sedan. The couple sought a private moment away from the prying eyes of their social circle and the complexities of their marriages. But the river held a sinister, unseen presence that they couldn't possibly have sensed. The mudflats beneath the dark water were not just idle earth, they were a bubbling cauldron of organic decay, churning silently beneath the tranquil surface. Something invisible was waiting in the reeds, a silent witness to the tragic final moments of two star-crossed lovers who thought they had finally found refuge in the dark. They had no idea that the very ground beneath them was exhaling something deadly. The morning sun had just begun to bake the riverbanks when two local teenagers, Michael McCormick and his friend Dennis, wandered down to the water's edge. It was around 8 o'clock on New Year's Day, and they were simply looking for lost golf balls near Fuller's Bridge to make a bit of extra money. Instead, they stumbled upon the body of Gilbert Bogle. He was lying face down near the edge of the water. The boys, young and naive, initially assumed he was just a partygoer who had far too much to drink and had passed out in the dirt. They left him there, continuing their search for another hour. But as they returned to the spot, drawn back by a nagging sense of unease, they realized the man had not moved an inch. As they crept closer, the horrific reality set in. Bogle's skin had turned a ghastly, unnatural shade of blue, and his chest was completely still. Panic set in, and the boys sprinted to a nearby kiosk to alert the shopkeeper, who immediately called for help. The initial assumption by the first responders was a tragic, sudden heart attack, but the arrival of the police would quickly shatter that simple explanation. When they began to look closer at the riverbank, they realized this wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the beginning of a nightmare. When the police finally arrived at the riverbank at 10 o'clock that morning, the scene was far more disturbing than anyone had initially realized. As officers began sweeping the nearby mudflats, one noticed a strange, unnatural mound tucked away from the main path. It was a pile of flattened cardboard beer boxes and a piece of discarded carpet, looking completely out of place against the raw earth. When he lifted the damp cardboard, he made a gruesome discovery. There lay the lifeless body of Margaret Chandler. She was positioned about 15 meters away from where Bogle had been found, her body carefully and deliberately covered by the material. This wasn't a simple medical emergency. It was a crime scene that appeared to have been meticulously staged. Naturally, the immediate suspicion fell upon the people the couple had left behind at the New Year's Eve party just hours earlier. Investigators quickly turned their focus toward Margaret's husband, Jeffrey Chandler. However, Jeffrey's reaction was anything but expected. He didn't break down or feign ignorance. Instead, he openly admitted to detectives that he was fully aware of his wife's attraction to Dr. Bogle. In fact, he claimed to have given Margaret his explicit blessing to take the physicist as a lover. Jeffrey also provided a solid alibi. He had left the party early to attend a bohemian gathering in Balmain and to spend the night with his mistress, Pamela Logan. This casual admission of an open marriage sent shockwaves through the conservative police force of the early 60s. To the detectives, Jeffrey's lack of jealousy didn't exonerate him. It made him the prime suspect in what looked like a cold-blooded, bizarre revenge killing. To truly understand the intense pressure placed on the Chandlers and their social circle, we have to look at the cultural landscape of Sydney in the early 1960s. This was an era defined by a rigid, conservative facade, where the nuclear family was seen as the bedrock of society, and moral propriety was strictly policed by the authorities. Yet, bubbling just beneath this polished surface was a subculture known as the Sydney Push. This was a group of left-wing intellectuals, writers, and academics who rejected conventional morality in favor of a more liberated existence. They gathered in smoky, dimly lit pubs, fiercely debating philosophy while practicing free love and open relationships. Jeffrey Chandler was deeply embedded in this avant-garde world, which stood in stark contrast to the conservative detectives investigating the deaths. The police were completely out of their depth, viewing the bohemian lifestyle not just as an eccentricity, but as something inherently criminal. This deep cultural divide colored every aspect of the investigation. The detectives became convinced that the bizarre staging of the bodies under cardboard was a symbolic act of shame, a physical manifestation of the moral disgust a killer would feel toward an adulterous couple. In their minds, the cardboard wasn't just a covering, it was a statement. This cultural prejudice potentially blinded them to the physical realities of the crime scene, as they were too busy looking for a motive in a lifestyle they couldn't begin to comprehend. As the weeks passed, the pressure on Jeffrey Chandler became suffocating. The media descended upon his life with a predatory intensity, painting him as a cold, calculating cuckold who had masterminded an untraceable assassination. The public, fueled by sensationalist headlines, practically demanded an arrest. But Jeffrey presented a compelling moral dilemma for the investigators that they couldn't quite resolve. If he were truly a jealous husband seeking a violent revenge, why had he so openly encouraged the affair in front of witnesses? It didn't fit the profile of a crime of passion. Why would he risk his own freedom and the stability of his children to murder a wife from whom he had already emotionally detached? More importantly, the logistics of the crime were baffling. How could he have possibly executed two simultaneous murders without leaving a single trace of physical violence or struggle? Detectives interrogated him relentlessly for hours on end, searching for even the smallest crack in his bohemian armor. They scoured his timeline, tracking every movement from the Chatswood party to the Balmain gathering, and finally to the home of his mistress. Every minute of his night was eventually accounted for, yet the suspicion lingered like a dark cloud over his head. Jeffrey found himself trapped in a waking nightmare, grieving the mother of his children, while simultaneously fighting to prove he wasn't a sociopathic genius capable of inventing an entirely new, undetectable method of murder. By May of 1963, the official coroner's inquest was finally underway, and the medical evidence presented by Coroner J.J. Looms threw the entire country into a state of utter confusion. Looms officially concluded that both Dr. Bogle and Margaret Chandler had died of acute circulatory failure. But in a stunning admission that left the courtroom silent, he stated on the record that he was entirely unable to determine the cause of this failure. The toxicology reports were meticulously clean. There were no traces of barbiturates, no heavy metals, no cyanide, and no known toxins of any kind in their blood. Furthermore, the bodies showed no signs of asphyxiation, no bruising, and no defensive wounds that would indicate a struggle. It was as if their hearts had simply decided to stop beating at the exact same moment for no discernible reason. The utter lack of physical evidence forced the police to abandon their murder theory against Jeffrey Chandler. The investigation hit a massive, impenetrable wall, and the case of the cardboard bodies officially went cold, leaving a trail of unanswered questions that would haunt the city for decades. For 40 years, the riverbank held on to its secret, waiting for science to catch up with the tragedy that unfolded in the mud. For over 3 decades, the Bogle-Chandler files sat in the archives, slowly gathering dust while the public's imagination ran wild. Rumors persisted throughout the years, ranging from far-fetched theories about secret LSD experiments to targeted assassinations by international spies. If you're following along with this investigation into one of Australia's greatest mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our upcoming deep dives into the world's most baffling cases. In 1996, forensic scientists even sent relic organ tissue samples to the United States, utilizing modern technology to test for LSD and other newly discovered synthetic compounds. Once again, the results came back completely negative. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But in 2006, an investigative filmmaker named Peter Butt decided to look past the sensationalism of the open marriage and the bizarre staging of the cardboard boxes. He stopped looking at the people and started looking at the environment itself. Butt connected two crucial, overlooked details from the original police reports. First, the specific location on the riverbank was notoriously polluted by nearby industrial sites. Second, the bodies exhibited a strange bluish discoloration, and witnesses reported a terrible, rotten egg smell clinging to the mudflats on the morning of the discovery. These pointed toward a terrifying, naturally occurring phenomenon that no detective in 1963 would have ever thought to look for. Let's rewind to that suffocatingly humid morning of January 1st, 1963, and look at the events through this new environmental lens. When Dr. Bogle and Margaret Chandler parked their car by the Lane Cove River, they weren't walking into a trap set by a jealous husband or a Cold War assassin. They were walking into a highly specific, highly volatile ecological trap. The riverbed was choked with decades of industrial waste and decaying organic matter that had settled into a thick, toxic sludge. Under normal circumstances, this sludge simply sat at the bottom of the water, undisturbed. But the extreme summer heat of that New Year's Eve, combined with a specific low tide that night, created a perfect storm of chemical reactions. The decaying matter in the mud began to produce massive, concentrated pockets of hydrogen sulfide gas. This gas is significantly heavier than air, meaning it does not rise and dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, it pools in low-lying areas, creeping along the ground like an invisible, toxic fog. When the couple lay down on the riverbank, they unwittingly positioned themselves directly inside an invisible, suffocating cloud of this deadly gas. It was a silent killer, odorless at high concentrations and lethal within minutes, settling over them as they sought a moment of peace. They never saw it coming, and they never had a chance to escape. Hydrogen sulfide is a master of deception. In low concentrations, it is unmistakable, carrying the pungent, sulfurous stench of rotten eggs. But when the gas reaches a certain threshold, it becomes far more insidious. It doesn't just smell worse, it actually paralyzes the olfactory nerves in an instant. You don't lose the scent because the gas has cleared. You lose it because your body has lost the ability to detect the danger. As Dr. Bogle and Margaret Chandler rested on that quiet riverbank, an invisible, heavy fog began to roll over them from the mud. Within just a few breaths, the toxic gas would have launched a brutal assault on their respiratory systems, stripping the oxygen directly from their blood and triggering a rapid, acute circulatory failure. This explains the medical impossibility that baffled coroners for decades. Hydrogen sulfide poisoning leaves almost no trace in the bloodstream after just a few hours, especially with the limited forensic tools available in 1963. It causes a near instantaneous loss of consciousness, which finally explains why there were no signs of a struggle or any defensive wounds. Even the bluish tint to Bogle's skin, noted by the boys who found him, is a textbook symptom of severe oxygen deprivation caused by this specific chemical asphyxiant. The pieces were finally clicking into place, explaining the tragedy that had remained a mystery for so long. While the gas explains the cause of death, it leaves one massive, glaring question unanswered. If they were killed by a natural environmental event, who covered Margaret Chandler's body with cardboard beer boxes? Who arranged Dr. Bogle's clothing? The answer is the final, chilling revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about their final moments. The gas didn't kill them instantly. As the hydrogen sulfide triggered acute hypoxia, their brains would have descended into a state of extreme confusion and terrifying delirium. In cases of severe oxygen starvation, victims often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. A burning sensation over the skin causes them to irrationally, desperately strip away their clothes. This explains why Dr. Bogle was found in such a disheveled, half-dressed state. But even more tragic is the mystery of the cardboard. In their final delirious moments of survival instinct, the couple likely realized they were dying from something rising from the ground itself. The cardboard boxes and the old carpet weren't brought there by a killer to hide a crime. They were desperate, improvised shields. Margaret, in a state of panicked delirium, likely crawled under that discarded rubbish on the riverbank, trying to build a barrier between herself and the toxic fumes rising from the mud. The cardboard wasn't meant to conceal her from the world. It was a futile, tragic attempt to hide from the very air she was breathing. The true horror of the Bogle-Chandler case isn't found in the malice of a human killer, but in the blind, terrifying indifference of nature. For decades, society projected its own moral anxieties onto these two bodies. The police, the media, and a judgmental public looked at the cardboard and saw a narrative of shame, adultery, and brutal revenge. They wanted a human villain to blame for the transgression of an open marriage and the perceived sins of the victims. But the reality was far more lonely. It was a solitary, agonizing fight for survival against an invisible enemy that didn't care about their lives or their reputations. Those final moments in the pitch-black darkness of the riverbank were a descent into madness. There was the sudden, inexplicable inability to draw a full breath, followed by the profound confusion as their bodies betrayed them. We can see the evidence of a desperate, crawling scramble through the mud to find anything, even a piece of filthy, discarded cardboard, to escape the suffocating earth. It is a psychological nightmare that strips away the sensationalized scandal and leaves only the raw, visceral terror of two human beings dying alone in the dark, desperately trying to understand why the very air itself had turned against them. Jeffrey Chandler lived the rest of his life under a lingering, heavy shadow of suspicion. To many, he was forever the man who might have gotten away with the perfect murder. He maintained his innocence until his final breath, a victim of relentless public scrutiny simply because his lifestyle offended the conservative sensibilities of the 1960s. The families of Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler endured decades of agonizing uncertainty, constantly subjected to tabloid rumors and wild conspiracy theories that refused to die. It wasn't until Peter Butt's 2006 documentary presented the hydrogen sulfide theory that a true sense of closure finally began to emerge. The scientific community widely embraced the explanation, recognizing it as the only theory that perfectly aligned with the bizarre medical evidence and the specific environmental conditions of the Lane Cove River. While the case technically remains officially unsolved on police records, the court of public opinion has largely accepted the tragic reality of the toxic gas. The mystery that captivated a nation for nearly half a century finally had an answer that was as scientific as it was tragic. The Bogle-Chandler mystery serves as a haunting reminder of our deep psychological need to find human patterns in senseless tragedies. We would much rather believe in a meticulous phantom killer then accept that the world itself can simply turn toxic without warning. It is a testament to how our cultural biases can completely blind us to the truth lying right in front of us. If this journey into the dark history of the Lane Cove River has captivated you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the case. We have many more investigations into the world's most baffling mysteries coming your way, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most perfect crimes are the ones committed by no one at all.